encourage you to follow us on Twitter. And without further ado, I'd like to welcome our moderator for the session, Paloma Duran, who is the head of the Global Partnerships and Policies Division of OECD. Welcome, Paloma.
Okay, thank you, Wanjiro. I'm very happy to be here among many friends and very, very good people, really, that we were working together. So I think that we have today a real challenge, which is try to discuss in an hour about the socio-economic response to COVID-19, taking into account the role of foundations. So what I'm going to do is to try to be dynamic and to have an interactive conversation, because I think that this is precisely the added value of this type of meetings. And as you know, we are going to have two keynote speakers, just trying to introduce in probably more general terms the situation and the socio-economic challenges and response to the COVID. And then we will have an interactive conversation with all the panels, the members of the panel that I will introduce. So first of all, I'm going to introduce my dear friend and former colleague, Ulrika Moder, that now is the Assistant Secretary General in the Bureau of External Relations in UNDP. And, but as I mentioned before to some of the panelists, with a very long story working on development and environment, and probably one of the best situated persons just to talk about this socio-economic response. So over to you, Ulrika.
Thank you so much, Paloma, and thank you for the opportunity to meet once again. It was a year ago that we met in this setting, and a lot has happened since. And could we have imagined? Yes, maybe we could. If we had prepared better, we would have done better, and we're still in the midst of the crisis. But it's my pleasure to give some welcoming remarks, and of course then also to start by welcoming the participants and the panelists. So I have Hilary Pennington, who's the Executive Vice President of Programs at Ford Foundation, my colleague Marcos Neto, who's the Director of the Finance Sector Hub, and also we are the co-organizers of this event together with Benjamin Belegi, who's the Executive Director of Wings, and the panelists that you will hear the discussion from. Lauren Bradford, the Senior Director of Global Partnerships, Candid, Ingrid Strinat, who's the Director of the Center of Social Impact and Philanthropy at Ashoka University, and then of course my former colleague and dear friend Paloma Duran, who's the Head of Division of Global Partnerships and Policies with OECD, as you heard. Now, you know that United Nations Development Programme, UNDP, has measured what we call human development since 1990. And it is, of course, perhaps not news any longer, but really of serious concern that we now have issued a report where we, for the first time since 1919, see a decline since the measurement began. Just to give some few figures, there are a lot of figures out there and a lot of data available also on our digital platforms. But in April already, it was estimated that about 50 million people would be pushed into extreme poverty. And now we're talking about 70 to 100 million expected to fall into extreme poverty. The United Nations framework for the immediate socio-economic response to COVID-19 calls for shared responsibility, the kind of shared responsibility that is really the foundation of the organization, as you know, celebrating its 75th birthday this year. It calls for global solidarity and urgent action for people in need. And the UN Secretary General's call for solidarity outlines 3 key areas for action. Coordination and cooperation to suppress the virus, of course, under the leadership of WHO, to minimize the socioeconomic impact of COVID-19 and to stimulate faster recovery. And here UNDP has been given the leadership role. And then, of course, as we say sometimes, to build back, but we don't want to go back, do we? We want to move onwards in a different way. We want to recover better with more inclusive and more sustainable development models. As I said, UNDP leads the socio-economic response and recovery on the ground. We're not doing that alone. It's done in coordination with our sister agencies, but also, of course, then beyond the UN system, in partnership with financial institutions, with the private sector, with philanthropy, and very much done, as we know, to gain the results we would like to see with the countries and actors in countries. And within 3 months, UNDP, if we just look at what we have done, we have mobilized 170 million in new funding from partners. We have repurposed, and I think it shows that we can be more agile than you would sometimes think that UN institutions are. We have repurposed 150 million US dollars in program funds in agreement with donors and partners. And we have dispersed to 130 country offices across 5 regions from a rapid response facility to really move fast and move, as we have said, also internally ahead of the curve to be able to respond to the socioeconomic impact that many times has hit the country before even the health crisis. We are championing, as we've been asked by the member states of the UN, an integrated response where we want to look at the multidimensional perspectives ranging from renewed pursuit of peace, encapsulated with the UN Secretary General's call for a global ceasefire, to decisive moves to tackle exclusion, racism, and also gender inequalities. And as I said, we really, as a development organization, want to offer a pathway beyond recovery. We want to give the young generation the hope that we can actually be back, if not on track, but really see to that we bring also the knowledge of the Sustainable Development Goals into the recovery plans. And that we can, instead of having this fall backwards, have the belief in a leap forward with the Sustainable Development Goals as our compacts. But we cannot, and we know this, and this was also the decision we took in 2015, deliver this on our own. We need to work with partners, and then of course our partners in philanthropy. You are critical to this. Your possibility to innovate, to mobilize resources in different ways, funds of course, but also the capacity that we would need. This is incredibly important. And we have seen it happening as a UN system. You know that the WHO, together with the United Nations Foundation and the Swiss Philanthropy Foundation, launched the first of its kind COVID-19 Solidarity Response Fund. And actually, in these times of polarization, we have also seen how actors come to support. So it has enabled private individuals, corporations, and institutions all across the world to come together and respond. And the fund has currently mobilized approximately 800 million US dollars. The UN welcomes philanthropy efforts to launch a community-based rapid response funds, diagnostics and vaccines that are being delivered at record speed in great collaboration with other actors. And philanthropy is indeed making significant contributions to respond to COVID. And I just want to mention some few examples, and you have many more. So the Jack Ma Foundation, a United Nations advocate for Sustainable Development Goals, has donated protective masks and test kits around the world. We have, of course, the Gates Foundation, Wellcome, Mastercard Foundation, that have partnered to contribute to more than 125 million in seed funding to speed up the response to the COVID-19 pandemic by identifying, assessing, and developing treatment efforts. Now, to finalize these quick,
but we have 1 minute.
Yeah, I'll finalize. Now, I think to say what is important to say is that we need to do this in partnership. And also, as my colleague Marcus, and you will come back to us later on during the session, said before we started the session, we really need also to make the best use of this platform that we created a couple of years back. There is much more potential in this platform. The possibility for you as philanthropists to make the best use of the data, the analysis, the socioeconomic assessments that we are doing at the country level, how we update that, and our understanding of what's happening on the ground can really be an asset to you. And we also need you to both, as I said, innovate, find solutions, really identify new partnerships, but also bring the assets that we need to make the change happen and to make us really get that leap forward instead of falling back, as we have seen that we risk of doing now if we look at the human development as compared to the many years that we've actually seen us moving forward. So I'm looking forward, and I'll stay on in the session, and I'll hand back to you, Paloma, and looking forward to listening to the discussions. Thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot, Ulrika, and thank you really for welcoming all the partners, all the members of the panel, and also everybody here, because I was with the impression that we are in a rush just to start, and that's the reason, because probably I didn't introduce properly to everyone. But thank you to all the panelists for being here, and thank you for your time. I think that now we're going to have the chance to listen to Hilary Pennington, who is the Executive Vice President of Programs in Ford Foundation. We are going to have the President of the Foundation very soon in the OECD. So I'm really glad to have also the possibility to listen let's say the other side of the coin, no? How the foundations can really work, not only as donors, but as real actors to implement the Agenda 2030, especially in these exceptional circumstances. So over to you, Hilary.
Thank you so much. It's really an honor to be with all of you. And I love the frame that Ulrika started with about building back better. Because I think, you know, if we are honest, it's not an exaggeration to say that this is an existential moment for our societies and for philanthropy itself. COVID-19 all around the world has laid bare long-standing, unacceptable inequities. Its disproportionate impact on the most marginalized in the US, on people of color, is provoking very, very important conversation and even some behavioral change. And I think it's important for us to look at all of the ways in which societies and governments are figuring out that they can do things now in this crisis that would have been inconceivable earlier. Sometimes in a negative way, tightening controls on society in the name of public safety, but also in very positive ways. Looking at my own country, cities are suddenly discovering that they can decarcerate people who've been imprisoned for low-level crimes. They can convert empty hotels into housing for the homeless. And our federal government is finding it possible to suspend student debt payments. And in the same way, foundations are discovering that they can provide much more flexible general support to their grantees. They can accelerate grant decisions. They can loosen heavy reporting requirements. So we are all under pressure to do more, and we should. I want to talk in particular about the things that I think philanthropy needs to do more of, and share with you some of the lessons we at Ford have learned in these last weeks and months. First, I think philanthropy has an obligation to get more money to our grantees fast. And second, to spend the money that we spend in a smarter way. On the subject of more money to more grantees, I happen to feel that this is not a moment for foundations to retreat from their current spending levels, despite the downturn in our endowments. Where possible, we need to increase or at least maintain our current spending levels. And many of you will have heard one of the ways in which Ford has decided to do this. We are maintaining our current spending levels, but because of the crisis, we felt that it really demanded something extraordinary from us. And so with the full support of our board, we went 2 weeks ago to the capital markets to take out a social justice bond, a social impact bond of $1 billion. We borrowed against our endowment, so we'll be paying that bond back over a 30 to 50 year period. But we will spend that $1 billion in the next 2 years, supporting core grantees so that they have the ability to play the role that societies need them to play, to really not be worried about where their next dollars are coming from, not be worried about whether they can keep the lights on, but play the roles that they need to play in society. We've also worked hard to get more money out the door more quickly through our standard processes, and to use our influence and our power to raise collaborative funds with other funders, pooled funds that provide resources that can be used to support and stabilize nonprofit organizations. So this is one very important thing that I think all foundations need to do, which is to ask ourselves, what can we do that may be above and beyond what we normally think is possible, so that we can rise to the challenge of the moment. But you know, just as society needs to build back better from the pandemic rather than returning to an old normal, we have to ask, I think, ourselves a set of harder questions. Can we, as philanthropy, and I think by extension also places like the UNDP, can we shift away from the inequities in who we fund to include and better support organizations led by people from communities most directly impacted by things like COVID? Can we expand our use of the kinds of flexible, multi-year general operating support that will make our grantees more resilient and better able to survive in times of crisis? And we have to ask ourselves what might stand in our way. And for philanthropy, there are very few external forces preventing systemic change. We, in philanthropy, are our own worst enemy, and we are therefore uniquely called to examine and change our own practices. And this will really require us to move away from the kinds of performative statements we are good at making that signal our value and our virtue to really much harder self-examination. So I want to share briefly 4 lessons from our own experience as one foundation on a journey towards a deeper and we hope more equitable and trust-based relationships with our grantees. First, we have to look at the fact that the way in which we fund organizations actually weakens them. Even before this pandemic hit in the United States, more than 60% of nonprofits faced fiscal distress. The average nonprofit has only 2 to 4 weeks of payroll in the bank. And this is in large part because of the way foundations fund them. The majority of support goes out in 1 year, project-based grants with limited amount that can be spent on overhead, rather than in a way that would provide long-term funding to strengthen institutions. So we need to think about how to change that. We also, second lesson we've learned is we tend to pay lip service to funding the communities most in need and most impacted, but who we fund tends to privilege the already privileged. By and large, philanthropy funds large organizations that know how to play the game. They know how to approach us, they know how to write grant proposals, they are capable of quickly receiving philanthropic dollars. But in a time like this, if we only double down on our existing grantees, we ourselves will increase inequality because we will underinvest in organizations led by the communities most impacted. If you look at the US, for example, we as philanthropy, organized philanthropy, underinvest in organizations led by communities of color. They represent about 50% of the population in my country, but they receive only 7% of total philanthropic dollars. So we need to take the risk as foundations of investing in organizations and leaders that are new to us and closer to the pain. Third lesson that we've learned at Ford, we have had to shed our own magical thinking that important change can happen quickly, advanced again by relatively small short-term grants. When we made the shift that we made in 2015 at Ford to focus on inequality, we had to question all of our timing expectations because of the nature of the work we do. We have funded for 80 years social justice kinds of change, and we know that in the challenges of social justice, where our grantees are often challenging long-standing power dynamics in their societies, they are playing a very long game. And success is measured in years, not in decades. Progress isn't linear. And as we can see today in the US in challenges to voting rights, civil rights, and we see all around the world in challenges to civil society, progress is often interrupted by setbacks and defeats and well-funded, well-organized opposition. So all of us, whether we're focusing on improving existing systems like education or economic development, or we're focused on more core social justice issues, have to understand that bending the long arc towards justice requires us taking the long view. And the ways in which we fund do not enable us to fund for the long game. And we at Ford had to look at the preponderance of grants we gave that were short-term and project-specific and begin to change that to longer term. So we have actually a program called Build, which through which we provide 5-year grants that are core general support to our grantees and also include a component to help them strengthen their institutions. And this we have learned in the hard way is a much better and more powerful way to fund our grantees. And I think the emphasis, recent emphasis in both in philanthropy and in international development on accountability and impact and control causes us to take the easy route out and not to think more deeply about what real accountability and trust look like, which resides in trust-based relationships with our grantees, funding them over multiple years and trusting that they know better than we do the most important ways in which they can have impact. So,
Hilary, sorry,
yes.
because we're saying very interesting things, but we need to finish. So.
Yes, I'm going to. My final point is that we fund fields of organizations. Fixing these big problems as we face in COVID is going to require us to think more beyond the level of organizations to the level of fields, and to partner in a much more vigorous way with the private sector, with government organizations. And let me end there. Let me stop there.
Okay, thank you so much, because I think that we need to organize another seminar, maybe just to discuss all the things that you raised, because I mean, you also mentioned the role of civil society space, also all the problems on authoritarianism in middle income countries and also among the donors. So there are many challenges here as a consequence of the COVID, but for sure, I mean, thank you so much. And also regarding the data that you mentioned, I was really shocked this morning because the last analysis that we did in the OECD related to foundations shows that only 16% of the flows of foundations reporting to us focus on gender equality and women's empowerment.
Yes.
Only 17% of civil society organizations funded by foundations reporting to the OECD were based in partner countries. Mm-hmm. With the bulk of finance going to international and donor country-based civil society organizations. So it's true that we have here many challenges, but I don't want to spend the time talking about the work that we are doing, but just listening to all the panelists. So thank you, Ulrika and Hilary, for the points that I think are very interesting just to start the conversation. First of all, giving the floor to Marcos Neto, who is now the director of the finance sector hub in UNDP, but probably the leader of this platform on sustainable development and foundations that I perfectly remember when was created when I was there as the director of the SDG Fund. So I think that I'm going to do something just to use in a better way the time, okay? I'm going just to introduce the 4 panelists that we are going to have, the 5, sorry. And then I will give a question by question to each one of you, okay? So we are going to have Marcos Neto, who is, as I mentioned, the director of the finance sector hub in UNDP. We have also Benjamin Beledi, who is the executive director of WINS. So thank you so much for organizing this. We are going to have also Lauren Bradford, who is the senior director of global partnerships at Candid. And also we have Ingrid Srinert, very well known for the work that she did in Civicus, but now I think that in university, in the Ashoka University in India. So I'm going to give the floor to each one of you. And the first question maybe is for Marco. I repeat that we would like to have more a conversation and just to refer to one another interventions. But I think that we also received a lot of questions through the chat, and I'm going to try to put everything together. So maybe Marco can kick off highlighting what foundations bring to the collective COVID response, and why is philanthropy such an important partner in this process.
Thank you. Thank you, Paloma. Thank you, Ulrika, Hilary. You know, it's a pleasure to be here among many friends. I recognize a lot of the names on the attendees. You know, I would like to spend a little bit of time, you know, reminding what is the SDG Philanthropy Platform and why was it created, then show how that work started back in 2014 is active now at COVID, and I'll give you a couple of examples to you directly. And then, you know, kind of open up this conversation with some of my great partners in journey for a long time. So back in 2014, when we were preparing the Agenda 2030, the Sustainable Development Goals, you know, Laurie and Brad Smith and Heather Grady, which was at the Rockefeller Foundation at the time, Ford Foundation, Ed Kane, which was at the Hilton Foundation together, and us at UNDP, realized that there was an important voice that was not being heard in the formal negotiations of the SDG by governments, and that was the voice of philanthropy, right? So we went on to create the SDG Philanthropy Platform as a vehicle, right, to create the space by which philanthropy could engage and could influence what became the SDGs in 2015, but also to internalize that SDGs back into philanthropy. That was important because when we look back at the MDG area, the Millennium Development Goal, there was very little buy-in and alignment, if you want, of philanthropy to the MDGs, right? And as Hillary mentioned, philanthropy is an incredibly strategic partner because it is one of the last free, you know, players in development from the point of view of resource allocation, but more important from the point of view of innovation, from the point of view of, you know, moving fast, like Ford did it with us when we create this very fuzzy idea at the time, and take some bets that can pay off in the long haul. So we create the SDG Philanthropy Platform. We play the global political process in 2014 and 2015. We, you know, engage more than 1,000 philanthropies from the global South and the global North. You know, so this is not it was not a process. We have this database of all of you and many more all over the world in that process. Then we took it down to the ground. So can we, UNDP, you know, facilitated at country level the work of philanthropy together with governments and NGOs, and can we actually create, you know, multi-stakeholder action? Right, and we did that in Kenya, we did that in Colombia, we did that in Zambia, we did that in India, we did that in Indonesia, several countries. So that brings me to the examples that I want to give it, that it started back then and is playing out now into this crisis. So for example, in Kenya, we actually, the SDG Philanthropy Platform, together with lots of the Kenya civil society and a lot of the philanthropy that is investing in Kenya, create the Kenya Philanthropy Association that didn't exist, right? That philanthropy association was an active player, not only on the government of Kenya planning for the SDGs, but also in the entire UN multi-year plan. For the first time ever, philanthropy was influenced the UN multi-year plan and the government multi-year plan. As a result, that a partnership which includes financial resources, was created between the UN, the government of Kenya, philanthropy, and the private sector, right? That partnership in the last 2.5 years has invested $7 million, right, to foster the primary healthcare and other priorities of the Kenya government for the SDGs, and done it in a parallel and coordinated way. Right? So it's not that philanthropy is giving money to the government, but philanthropy is aware and was part of understanding where the government of Kenya wanted to go, right? And then it was able to come along together with the government of Kenya, right? And that has actually created affordable healthcare for 25 million Kenyans at the moment. Now, that same structure is now pivoting, right, to response to COVID. And, you know, helping the government define its recovery plan and its response, and supporting in a flexible fund, you know, the government response for COVID. So that coming together in the past made the response now quite effective. The same has happening in Colombia, right? The SDG Philanthropy Platform facilitated 17 foundations in Colombia to go to one place, one department in Colombia at the beginning of the peace process in Colombia, the Antioquia department. Now, initially, each one of those foundations went down there and wanted to do whatever their project was. It took some time and some crafted and use of methodologies, right, to get everybody to agree on a common work with the government, the local government. And that has been going on for a while. And now, with COVID-19, that alliance that has been playing in Antioquia has developed a response plan for Antioquia and for Colombia, connecting foundations with each other, with the public and private sector, generating synergies and influencing the target orientation of social interventions in the public sector. So we created the SDG Philanthropy Platform as a mechanism, right, to connect philanthropy, governments, multilateral processes, politically and practically on the ground. We did the same in Brazil. We had Paula Fabiani here, I saw, and in Brazil, a lot of that work has happened in the past and is still going on right now. So going forward, right, we hope, and that's come back to Ulrika's point, we as UNDP, as the technical lead of the UN system, preparing the socio-economic impact assessment in 170 countries, which are leading to the socio-economic recovery plans, which we wanted to be ambitious to build back better. We are ready through the SDG Philanthropy Platform to make all this data available to all of you. So you know, as you respond in a country like Kenya or Colombia or Brazil or Zambia, you know what the government and what the other stakeholders are going for, and you can join those forces in the way that Hillary is talking. Because the only way, and I'll finish here, that we can build back better, that we can live by the mantra of Winston Churchill, let's never let a crisis go to waste, is by coming together. If we try to do our stuff in isolation, we'll be finding ourselves back where we are now in the next crisis. And remember, climate change is just around the corner waiting for us, right? So we gotta come back together, and we have a ready-made platform that you can use it as philanthropy going forward. Thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot, Marco. Thank you so much. I think that probably with this idea really to take care of the most in need and leave no one behind, which is really the goal that we are trying to achieve with all this work, maybe Benjamin is very well positioned really to talk about that, especially because WINS is an organization that works with more than 100 philanthropy associations from all over the world, working in 45 countries, which is really a lot. And very happy really, Benjamin, to meet you here, because WINS recently joined the steering committee of the Global Partnership for Effective Development Cooperation, where UNDP and the OECD have the joint secretariat work. So thank you so much for this, because it's really an effort for WINS. But I think that you are very well positioned to talk about the 6P, if we can add one on preparedness, taking into account the situation that we are living. So over to you, Benjamin.
Thank you very much, Paloma, and thanks already to the great speakers we just had. I mean, I just want to echo what Marcos was saying about the importance of articulation and collaboration between the philanthropic sector and other sectors, of course, government, other funders of the SDGs, but even the private sector and business. And if we want to really be able to move the needle at a more systemic level than we have maybe in the past, that's the main priority we should have in mind, and that priority takes vehicles, takes platforms, takes initiatives like the SDG Philanthropy Platform, which is just one form and one example, and there are many other ways in which these connections can happen at the local level, at the national level, and that's absolutely critical to unlock the potential of philanthropy in terms of impact, which is much beyond the sort of safety net or complementary additional resources to failing states or shrinking welfare states, for example. And And so that's really a shift which is complicated and delicate to implement, but we have a number now of frameworks, of tools, of organizations that are able to make that happen. And we're glad to be part of the Sdg Philanthropy Platform, which is, I think, a critical instrument, but also of the Global Partnership for Effective Development Cooperation, which plays a slightly different role, but really helps define some norms, values, and concrete practices also that can be implemented for more collaboration in the response plan. And so to prepare that discussion today, I was looking a little bit at the philanthropic response, and I know that our colleague Lauren from Candid will probably give a great deal of interesting numbers and data. But maybe the first thing I think we should notice about the response of the philanthropic sector globally is that we've seen a really incredible surge in donations, giving, and grants. And that's not just about foundations or institutional philanthropy, but really about everybody's giving role, and this boundary between foundations or institutional philanthropy on the one hand, individual giving on the other hand, communities, is starting to blur more and more. And I think it's important that we accelerate that movement and connect the dots. But anyway, just to give an example of that, in Brazil, for example, our member ABCR has tracked the donations and giving, which are both corporate, individual, etc., and it has reached $1.3 billion for the COVID response to date, which is really astonishing. And in a country where the culture of giving and institutional philanthropy is still growing, is still developing, and it's something really interesting to see how we can build on that movement to create more philanthropic societies on the long term, and not just as a response to a crisis. And I think we have there a great opportunity. I think in China, the response was also impressive, and our member Yishan, I just have the numbers from April or May, but that was already beyond $5 billion from philanthropic organizations for the response to the crisis in China. And so that also shows some shifts that also echoes some of the geopolitical shifts that we see globally, also in the philanthropic sector, new leadership and new philanthropies playing a more and more important role. So that was the first thing I wanted to highlight. And of course, at Wings, we created a global resource hub. So that's basically a platform that I invite you all to visit, which brings together all the different initiatives from the philanthropic sector globally. So emergency funds, reflections, new frameworks, and so on. So that's where we've been able to identify some of this information. And we saw a lot of response funds created not just in the US, but everywhere. And that's really interesting. And I think that what Hillary was presenting in the beginning of the call was really the energy that we see in the sector and some of the reflections that are being pushed to transform the philanthropic sector, especially around trust building with partners and actors, for fundraising, increasing spendings, and so on. And our hope is that this is not just a punctual reaction to the situation, but that can turn into new norms for the sector on the long term. Still with this idea of making a difference on the long term and a systemic difference. So we hope that these pledges that are circulating now in Europe, in North America, and other parts of the world, they can be translated into something which is a new norm for the sector. I also wanted to highlight the key role of the infrastructure in all of this for philanthropy. So all these actors, networks, associations, support organizations, advisors, all those who are building the field. And I think the crisis has highlighted how much critical these actors are and under valued they have been in the past. And I think that we've seen really very interesting correlation between how much philanthropy was included in the response plans and how much the policies of governments in the response plan were favorable to philanthropy, and the existence and an active mobilization of these infrastructure organizations. CAF, for example, Charities Aid Foundation in the UK, they've looked at the policies and they saw that it was a kind of best practice in the UK from government in terms of allowing philanthropy to play a key role. And that's because CAF and others have been advocating a lot for that, and it didn't happen, or it didn't fall from the sky. And we've seen a few other examples like this in the US, in France, in other parts of the world, where these actors and umbrella organizations have advocated for years, but also during this crisis, and they've obtained results that represent millions or even billions of dollars now available to civil society because it has been facilitated by these policies. So I think this is really a critical element, and something that I hope can contribute to elevating the importance of this reflection in the development agenda, in the localization agenda for the SDGs, and so on. Because if you take the counter example of India that I'm sure Ingrid will cover, so I won't say too much, but the lack of infrastructure has led to quite the contrary. And so that's really something I think that we really need to highlight strongly. So again, I think that we've seen really interesting elements. I'm sure there's been a lot of innovation, but overall what we've seen is a bit traditional, except for maybe more flexibility. But I think that I have not seen enough response targeting the frontline organizations, grassroots communities, and it's always easy to support some of the bigger NGOs or some of the government funds, which is needed, but it's not enough. And there's a role for philanthropy to play in really helping the communities, self-organized communities, respond. So I think that's again linking back to the need for an infrastructure. And a good example of what is possible with this local infrastructure is in Africa. Our colleagues at Trust Africa, Southern African Trust, Africa Philanthropy Forum, they've created an initiative called Community Immunity. And that's basically, a pooled fund that can allow to support their communities together them to make that happen. So it takes this kind of organizations initiative. That's really a wise investment. So I'll just finish by saying that I think we could have done much better, and we can do much better in the future, including a platform which I think has a really important role. And we must ignore the context in which the response we're talking about is happening. In context of shrinking space for civil society, the ICNL has monitored that there were, I think, over 150 government measures that are restricting freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, and so basically restricting the civic space. And so that's what we need to have in mind when we think about our response, because that could enable or block whatever our attempts to have the society recover. We're also more broadly in a system of attacks on multilateralism, attacks on democracy, and the sector itself needs to come together. And yeah, I'm done. The sector needs to come together as one, also at the global level, to promote multilateralism in philanthropy.
Yes.
Also, and especially in a global crisis like that, where the issue is global. And so that we need to start thinking outside of our usual boxes in the field, and reinvent ourselves and reinvent philanthropy to make that happen.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Benjamin. I think that this is one of the things that maybe we need to discuss probably in another webinar. So I'm just preparing the next program of work. But I think that for sure is the role of philanthropy in the promotion of multilateralism, especially in the situation where we are. And I think that, Benjamin, there is another challenge. I mean, you mentioned the need really to work together and the networks, and each country is completely different. But also the reality, at least what we see in the OECD with the work that we are doing with foundations, is that when we want to have data, it's sometimes very complicated to have the data from foundations. I mean, normally we try to work in a very general way, trying to see the priorities, the practices, the behavior that they have with the partners. But at the end, sometimes philanthropy is not very well known in some in some areas or in some areas of work precisely because of the lack of data. But I suppose that Lauren now is going to give us some inputs about that. So Lauren Bradford is the lead of the Global Partnerships and Initiatives in Candid, precisely working on data. I'm happy to have a former colleague of the OECD here with us. So Lauren, over to you, that probably you will have the response for all the issues related to data for foundations.
Thank you. Well, it's great to be here with everyone, with all colleagues. It's nice to see everyone's faces. So I just want to start by saying that while we are talking about COVID, and Hillary already touched on this, and we're looking at funding flows and philanthropy's response, at the same time, we're also looking at or experiencing the breakdown of structural racism. And that is also impacting funding, or it will impact funding. So there is this sort of diversion of funds going on at the same time, which I think is really important to note. It adds an additional layer. And so at Candid, we've been collecting funding data, both for the SDG Philanthropy Platform by SDG funders, and then we've zeroed in on the COVID response as well. So just to go back to the SDG Philanthropy Platform for a moment to tie into Marcos's comments. The funding data that we've collected now since 2016 for philanthropic giving to the SDGs totals over $200 billion, with over 33% or $65 billion going to SDG 3, good health and well-being specifically. So that's the setup for the SDG piece. And now, as a result, we have, of COVID and of our work on the SDGs, created a coronavirus pop-up page, we're calling it. And that is where we're tracking our funding data. And in addition to that, we've also undertaken a survey of surveys to better understand how the sector is both responding and what the challenges the sector in terms of philanthropy and civil society are experiencing. So I'll just share a few of the data points in terms of the funding, some of which have already been touched on. So our site includes the latest funding going toward the pandemic. It includes a list and a map of all of these funds, available funds, a list of RFPs for those searching for funding, as well as news from the field. And we're also collecting a list of global resources on COVID funding as we come across them, much of which links across to the Wings page as well. So we've got a nice sort of information sharing going on there. So as of today, we've collected funding data totaling over $12 billion. So it's a pretty significant number from over 6,000 grants, pledges, and commitments. And this number is updated on a daily basis. So you can check back to the page each day and see if that number has shifted or not. Now, these figures are primarily from US foundations, companies, and notable individuals. And we are working to capture the most complete picture of international funding and local fundraising campaigns related to the immediate and long-term effects of the pandemic. But the best way for us to do that is for colleagues on this call and our networks to actually share that data with us. We're collecting it as fast as we can through different forms of technology and through our partnerships, and especially when it comes to languages beyond English, that is also harder for us to obtain. So that's a call to action to everyone to share the data so we can build out this global picture for everyone. This is publicly available data. So in addition to the pledges and commitments, we're also keeping track of funds created by foundations and nonprofits, and we've collected information on over 830 funds so far. Many of those funds have already made disbursements focused on health and human services, as well as public safety, education, and community and economic development. And what we're seeing is numerous sources are reporting that the pandemic is disproportionately affecting minority communities. And I think we've touched on that in the call, and Hillary very eloquently described that. So what we're seeing so far in the data is only less than 0.2% in fact of COVID-19 funding, and only 3% of grants indicate an explicit focus on minority populations. So there's a lot of work to do, I think, there. And the funds are generally targeted for specific geographic areas rather than specific population groups. And to the points touched on by Benjamin specifically in terms of where the funding is coming from that we're seeing, The United States and China continue to be the largest sources of COVID-19 philanthropy, followed by India, Brazil, and the UK, who have now surpassed Italy as the next largest geographic sources. But again, this is only based on the available data that we're able to collect directly from foundations or through press releases or public communications. We know that companies and their foundations account for 66% of global COVID-19 private funding, which is down from 77% in early April. And 72% of COVID-19 recipients are listed as multiple or not named. So we don't actually know where all of the money is going in types of organizations, and we can guess it's probably to larger organizations that have the ability to absorb the funding or are already known to the major donors. So that does limit the ability to analyze the data and get the insights on who is being served. And it really means we need to lift up the local organizations. So that's the funding piece. I won't go into the survey piece because we don't really have time now, but just to say that we have done this survey of surveys of over 49 surveys from 47 organizations, basically 50-50 to the US, 50-50 globally. And we will be sharing out that information soon publicly by way of a blog. And I think the findings there are very interesting as well, that generally people are experiencing the same challenges regardless of geography. So I'll leave it there so Ingrid can bring us home.
Okay, thank you so much, Lauren. I think that, many interesting things also. So, before to give the floor to Ingrid, I'm going to ask if the panelists can stay an additional 5 minutes because we are completely against the clock. Just please to have some opportunity to have some question, or if everybody can be, I understand that Marco has some problems. Okay, good, you can stay, only 5 minutes. So Ingrid, as I mentioned before, she was working in Civicus. Probably you are very famous because the work that you did there. But now you are in the role of the university professor, which is a little bit different probably. But happy also to listen to you coming also from a different angle or probably from a different perspective. Thanks a lot, Ingrid. Go ahead.
Thank you, Paloma, and thank you for everyone really for including me in this conversation. I think there's 6 important things I want to say about with an India-specific lens, and really looking more closely at the relationship between government and philanthropy during this crisis. I think the first thing is something that others have said before, which is the response to the crisis has been unprecedented. In India, we have, as of date, about 750,000 detected cases of the virus, which is large. It puts us at number 3 in the global sort of rankings of this thing, but in some senses on the scale of India is actually a relief that it's not much larger. The second thing really is the scope of the response. This has not just been organized philanthropy, as Benjamin just pointed out, or even corporate philanthropy, though both of those have stepped up in huge measure. The response has been from citizen groups, from chefs to comedians, to film stars, to sports people, you name it, just ordinary citizens everywhere have chipped in to the best of their ability. And that, I think, is important because it's brought a whole new generation of people to philanthropy and to civic activism, but also brought whole new segments. So for example, a large initiative in India was an initiative that came out of the startup community that has actually invested its funds in social enterprise type operations that are developing new technologies that help address the pandemic. So I think there's new forms of philanthropy, new sources of philanthropy, and a whole new generation that's been mobilized, and that's important to me. I think the response really takes 2 big forms in India. One is where philanthropy has tried to substitute for either the lack of government response or the inadequacy of a government response. So this ranges from everything from providing equipment and testing and food and transportation to hospitals and health workers, but also to responding to the socio-economic dimensions of it in terms of millions of migrant workers who found themselves cut off not only from their livelihoods, but also from their homes and families, and were struggling to survive and to get back home. You must have all seen the pictures of people that have walked for literally 1,000 kilometers to reach home. And philanthropy and citizen action has really played a huge role, not just in responding to that need, but in ensuring that the needs of communities like that, like migrant workers, like sex workers, like transgender communities, like people with disabilities, got noticed, got put on the radar, and got responded to both by private philanthropy and by state policy. So those two major forms, I think, are important to recognize. I think it's also important to note that, as Benjamin pointed out, unlike other countries, in India, there has been little or no support for philanthropy or civil society from the government. So we don't have the big bailout packages that you see in Canada or the UK, or even in Russia and China, which have responded with, tax incentives and support to ensure that civil society is able to protect against job losses, for example. We have none of that yet in India. In fact, in some ways, the new fund that was set up by our Prime Minister, which collected $1.1 billion literally in the matter of weeks, has actually diverted money from what would have gone to grassroots organizations and to civil society that could respond in an agile, customized kind of manner into sort of big, slow, ponderous government response now. I think the heartening thing is that the government did acknowledge and has acknowledged the incredible role that's been played by the private sector, by philanthropy, and by civil society, and somewhat belatedly has managed to put together coordination mechanisms that are allowing for better complementarity, better sharing of information, better coordination across these segments. Because in the absence of either a strong government coordination mechanism, as well as Benjamin pointed out, a lack of a strong philanthropy ecosystem, what we were running the risk of was that responses were going to be delayed, they were going to be duplicated, they were going to, stumble over each other rather than being able to allocate resources in the most optimum manner possible. Coming to the SDGs, as all of you know way better than me, India accounts for a disproportionate amount of the gap in the achievement of the SDGs. Before this crisis hit, the estimates were that we needed $560 billion a year to reach our SDG targets. As the SDG report yesterday points out, those targets have now gotten further away because so many more people have slipped back into poverty. So many more children have dropped out of school. So many more girls have been married off at an early age. So many more women are subject to violence and other threats. And so it's really going to take an all of society response of the kind that we've seen in COVID, if we're going to have a hope of India actually achieving the SDGs. I think there is reason for optimism, because though it was slow in coming, I think there's now the relationships that have been built between government, philanthropy, civil society, and business, the networks that have been created, the mechanisms that have been created to respond now offer the potential really to bring that all of society response to the SDGs, but to a range, and also opened up the window of opportunity on policy. So stuff like universal basic income or public universal healthcare or things like that, which were unthinkable 4 months ago, are suddenly just obvious solutions. And so I think we really have the potential to make a big push at mobilizing these newfound assets towards achieving the SDGs.
Okay, thank you, Nadia. I think that you was, Ingrid, sorry. I think that you was the most obedient member of the panel, I tell you. So thank you so much. I think that I'm not in a position really to summarize all the ideas, but just only 3 points. The first one is that the COVID pandemic must not derail our focus from the Agenda 2030. It's a challenge, but of course the agenda is there, and many people, unfortunately, really living in a terrible situations. Second, even taking into account the pressure to focus in the short-term responses, this is a time of opportunity for multilateralism, as Benjamin pointed out, and also to build a greener and more sustainable future together. And the third point is that the effective partnerships are at the heart of impact and scale, and in particular to reach the most affected and vulnerable populations in partner countries. But still, there are some questions pending. First of all, I mean, with the data that we have in the OECD, we can confirm that the foundations, at least the biggest foundations, support mainly the middle-income countries. So how can foundations support solutions for those farthest behind? Second, how can COVID-19 help induce a culture change among foundations to share data? That will be really an important asset for the future. And third, how can governments and other larger foundations work toward a more inclusive partnership with smaller foundations and also with local civil society organizations? So unfortunately, we don't have the time really to reply to everything, but my understanding is with the questions that we receive and with comments also from the participants, I think that the idea is to prepare some blocks where all the members of the panel will be invited really to contribute. So I'm really sorry to finish, but we don't have more time. We don't have a possibility to open our conversation. But I wanted again to say thank you to WINS and UNDP for organizing this event that I think is important, especially for philanthropy. Thank you so much for inviting me and also the OECD to be here. Thank you to Wanjiro and Nadia, that I think that were the two pillars working behind and trying to be sure that everything is on time and very well prepared. So thanks a lot. Thank you so much. Apologies for the lack of time, and next time we will do better. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
So thank you, Benjamin.